Daughter of the Stars, the Indians called it, and Shenandoah it has been known as ever since. Behind me is the great Valley of Virginia in all of its splendor and beauty. Yet in 1862, it became a battlefield, and the Southern general defending it became immortal. I'm James Robertson, and Blue Ridge Public Television and I cordially invite you to watch Jackson in the Shenandoah. Jackson's Shenandoah Valley extended from Stanton 125 miles north to the Potomac River. The eastern border of the valley was the picturesque Blue Ridge Range. To the west were the imposing Alleghanies. In average width, the valley was 30 miles. The Shenandoah extended in a northeasterly direction. It was like a spear aimed at the very heart of the North. And for the Confederacy, it could be a line of advance, a line of communication, as well as a line of retreat. Of equal importance to the Confederacy were the agricultural holdings here in the valley. It was a veritable breadbasket for the Confederacy. Horses, livestock, poultry, corn, wheat, orchards, all were raised here in tremendous abundance, so that the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's premier army, literally depended upon the valley for its livelihood. In the spring of 1862, the days of the young Southern Confederacy seemed numbered indeed. The North had secured Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Out in the West, General U.S. Grant had seized Forts Henry and Donelson and was driving through West Tennessee. On the Atlantic coast, Union forces had occupied Roanoke Island, North Carolina, and Port Royal, South Carolina. And in Virginia, George B. McClellan was leading the largest army ever seen in the Western Hemisphere in a Union offensive up the Virginia Peninsula toward the Confederate capital. In command of the Confederate forces was General Joseph E. Johnston at Manassas, but Johnston, outflanked and outmanned, had given up Northern Virginia and was falling back rapidly to the aid of Richmond. In short, nothing remained in Virginia to stop this Union offensive but one man who was in charge of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He was 150 miles away. He was unknown, unheralded, but he was about to make history, and a campaign so brilliant that it is still taught at military academies around the world. So much loneliness and sadness marked his childhood that he would not talk about it in later years. Such was the start in life of Thomas Jonathan Jackson. He was born in January 1824 in the village of Clarksburg, nestled in the mountains of what was then northwestern Virginia. His father, an impoverished attorney, died when Tom was 2 years old. A wife and 3 children were left destitute. When the lad was 7, his mother gave him away to other members of the Jackson clan. The mother died shortly thereafter. With her passing, young Jackson lost the one anchor, the one sanctuary he had to have in an unstable existence. Tom Jackson spent his youth on the family estate at Jackson's Mill, a dozen miles south of Clarksburg. A bachelor uncle, Cummings Jackson, was his guardian. The unscrupulous, money-conscious uncle gave him a home, instructions in a number of farm chores, and a methodical way of life. For 11 important years, the orphan received security. What he never got was the love so basic to the growing years of life. Only to a younger sister, orphaned to an uncle and aunt some distance away, did Jackson express terms of endearment. In 1842, somewhat by default, he gained an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. Jackson was anxious to go. The school offered a free education. It had one of the finest engineering curricula available, and it would likely be the only opportunity Jackson would have to make something of himself. The mountain orphan was poorly prepared for the academic demands of West Point. Jackson initially appeared to have little chance of surviving the first year's studies. Yet the tall, heavy-set, but bumpkin-like figure applied himself with a determination that caught the attention of everyone at the academy. Jackson studied day and night. He had no time for friendships and took no part in social activities. His 4 years as a cadet turned on one of his favorite axioms: you may be whatever you will resolve to be. Not only did Jackson graduate in the famous class of 1846, he stood 17th among 59 classmates. Faculty and cadets alike insisted that if the curriculum had lasted one more year, Thomas Jackson would have graduated first in his class. Determination became Jackson's hallmark. The Mexican War immediately summoned the young artillery officer. He quickly demonstrated that the military was his true vocation and war his natural element. Jackson won 3 brevet promotions for gallantry in the field during a 6-month period. At the age of 23, he was one of the most decorated American soldiers in Mexico. In the lull of peacetime Army life that followed, Jackson sought a religious denomination with which he could comfortably exercise an increasingly burning devotion to God. He also worried about a host of physical problems, some genuine, others imagined. He became an exercise buff before calisthenics was fashionable. Jackson's ideas on diet were severe, but faithfully followed. He once told a startled hostess that he never used pepper because it made his left leg itch. Jackson's life took a major turn in 1851 when the 27-year-old brevet major accepted an offer to join the faculty at a fledgling academy located in Lexington at the southern end of the Shenandoah Valley. The school was called the Virginia Military Institute. In this second-floor room in the barracks at VMI, Stonewall Jackson, for 10 years, taught a course called Natural Philosophy and Optics, which was an unnatural mixture of just about everything: physics, chemistry, astronomy, magnetism, and the like. For 10 years, he taught young teenagers who, as freshmen and sophomores, ridiculed him, belittled him as a poor professor, but as juniors and seniors came to see the greatness that was in the man. Many of these boys would later serve under him. A large number died for him. So many VMI graduates were with Jackson as he prepared to make the great attack at Chancellorsville that the general was heard to say, "The Institute will be heard from today." And it was. Jackson remains the living symbol of Virginia Military Institute and all for which it stands. Jackson and VMI are intertwined almost into one being. This is evident in the displays at the Institute's on-campus museum. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Gibson is director of museums, as well as a helpful friend to every serious historian who seeks his help.
Professor Jackson wore this blue Virginia militia officer's uniform, as did all the faculty at VMI in the pre-war years. This particular one has an added significance in the fact that it is also the one Jackson wore on that day that he earned his celebrated nickname, he and the brigade, indicated by the Brigadier General's straps, which have been added to the shoulders. Of course, that's not Confederate regulation, but it's the regulation that Jackson, as a former United States officer, would have been most familiar with. Of course, Jackson spent many hours laboring, as did his students, at this old blackboard from his section room in the barracks. During Jackson's celebrated Valley campaign, he was seen often on the battlefields wearing this dilapidated kepi, perhaps made by Mrs. Jackson. At least Jediah Hotchkiss thought that Mrs. Jackson made this kepi. But of course, the most poignant item, perhaps, is the raincoat that Jackson was wearing on that fateful late evening of the 2nd of May at Chancellorsville as he went to examine the disposition of his troops across the field after his very successful flank march and attack of the Union right flank. Jackson was leaving his headquarters when one of his staff officers suggested that he might put on this old slicker because Jackson had been indicating that he might not be feeling well and it was a damp mist in the air. So Jackson wears this coat as he marches off on Little Sorrel and his staff into the front of his lines, and has the unfortunate mishap of coming back down the road when he's fired upon by his own pickets from North Carolina that are in the line. The coat still carries the scars of that moment, with the bullet hole in the upper left sleeve and one down closer to the wrist. Ultimately, the coat is returned to Mrs. Jackson through General Lee, who by this time is living here in Lexington. General Lee recognizes the coat and says, "I've seen Jackson wear it on many occasions," and it is Lee who then presents the coat to Mrs. Jackson, ultimately returning here to VMI.
Genuine happiness comes from turning a house into a home. Jackson had but one home in his adult life. Located in Lexington, it is now wonderfully preserved by the Stonewall Jackson Foundation, whose director is hardworking and congenial Michael Ann Lynn.
This was already an old house when the Jacksons purchased it. It had been built around 1800 with a large stone addition that was put on in the mid part of the century. Jackson and Anna moved in early 1859 and had a little over 2 years here together, 9 months of which they were probably alone together in the house. The rest of the time they were traveling up north or seeking medical treatment or entertaining family who came for visits.
A childhood home and family love are basic foundations of life. Thomas Jackson had neither in the real sense. From the existence of an orphan in the mountains of Western Virginia, he would go on to West Point, a lonely boy, win his fame in the Mexican War, and in 1851, he came here to Lexington, Virginia. Here in the parlor of this home, he and his second wife would know joys the likes of which had never before touched his life. Jackson knew pathetically little about adult or civilian life when he came to Lexington, and his rude ways, his country style, habits quickly caused him to be labeled an oddball here in Lexington. But it was here in this town that he learned social graces, that he learned, for example, which fork to use for what, when to use this knife, how to use that spoon. He found and established worship, the Presbyterian Church. He became an astute businessman, serving on the board of directors of more than one corporation in this town. And in the 10 years that he was in Lexington, he quickly matriculated, if you will, from an eccentric former Army officer into a good citizen and a good Christian. On Sunday afternoon, April 21st, 1861, Jackson led the VMI Corps of Cadets from Lexington to Richmond. The young cadets were to serve as drill masters for the thousands of eager recruits flooding into the state capital. Jackson gained appointment as a Confederate colonel. His first assignment was to take charge of the post at Harper's Ferry. It was the northernmost point of the Confederate States, the site of a famous arsenal, the junction of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, and the entrance into the strategically vital Shenandoah Valley. Jackson's small force consisted of everything from gaudy militia to enthusiastic recruits to bewildered teenage volunteers. Yet with calm authority and infectious self-assurance, he soon brought order where chaos had been. Late in May, Jackson received appointment as commander of all Virginia soldiers in the Lower Valley. Subsequent organization of those units produced what initially was called the 1st Brigade of Virginia. Promotion to brigadier general came to Jackson on the eve of the opening major battle of the Civil War. That collision took place in northern Virginia along Bull Run at a place called Manassas. On a hot Sunday in mid-July, Jackson's brigade took position on a hilltop commanding the entire southern position. When Union soldiers broke through the first line of Confederate defenders and swept up the hill in anticipation of victory, Southern General Bernard B. sought to inspire his faltering troops by shouting, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Confederate success and an immortal nickname were the results of the battle. Yet the shy, unpretentious former professor did not capture the popular imagination of a war hero of that day. He continued to be a virtual unknown in the war for several months to come. Late in 1861, Jackson was elevated to Major General and assigned to command all Confederate defenses in the Shenandoah Valley. He welcomed the new appointment to that part of Virginia closest to his heart. Quickly he made his way to his new headquarters at Winchester. This historic trading center was virtually key to control of the northern end of the valley. For half of the year to come, Winchester would be Jackson's adopted home. He initially made his headquarters at the Taylor Hotel in the center of town. When the crowds became too large and too noisy, Jackson accepted the invitation to move into a private home several blocks away near the end of a residential street. His wife joined him for most of the winter months. "If only I had my little woman here," Jackson wrote in the autumn of 1861, "but through the blessings of an ever-kind Heavenly Father, I am quite comfortable here." This is Alta Vista, the home of Colonel Lewis T. Moore, who had served under Jackson at the Battle of First Manassas, where he had received a serious leg wound. When Jackson arrived at Winchester in November 1861, Colonel Moore, still recuperating from his injury, graciously offered him the hospitality of this, his home. It was basically a cottage, T-shaped, 3 rooms downstairs, 3 rooms upstairs. It was only 1 block off the main thoroughfare. It was 2 blocks from where Anna would come to live when she arrived in Winchester, and it was very close to the fairgrounds, where the major Confederate encampments were located. All in all, it was an ideal headquarters for the man who had charge of the Shenandoah Valley. This is Jackson's headquarters room at Alta Vista, the Lewis Moore residence. It was here in the winter of 61 and 62 that he faced the heavy responsibilities thrust upon him by the Confederate government. His duties in the valley were twofold. One, he had to protect the valley from intrusion by federal forces, and secondly, should such forces come into the valley, Jackson had to block them from leaving the Shenandoah and going to the help of General George B. McClellan and the major Union Army then threatening Richmond. On the surface, it seemed so absolutely impossible. Jackson had 3,000 men, and he was facing a Union Army in excess of 38,000. And yet, as Jackson wrote a friend on March 3rd, 1862, "If this valley is lost, Virginia is lost." And determination was going to be Jackson's major virtue as a military officer. An 18th century philosopher once commented that a good horse was the noblest conquest man has ever made. Famous mounts were commonplace in the Civil War. Lee had his Traveler, McClellan his Daniel Webster, Grant his Cincinnati. Jackson, too, had a favorite. Behind me is the general's most constant companion in the war. This is little Sorrel, the favorite of the 4 animals that Jackson rode. He obtained the horse from a dozen C's from a Baltimore and Ohio railroad train at Harper's Ferry in the first weeks of the war. Jackson intended to give the horse to his wife, but after riding it once, a bonding occurred between horse and rider. The animal initially was called Fancy, but to one and all it became Little Sorrel. It was a durable animal, one of the fastest in all of the Confederate armies. Immune to battle noises, it bolted only once in the Civil War, and that came when Jackson was mortally wounded by his own men. The horse lived to the age of 36, only 3 years younger than Jackson. And at its death, all the flags here at VMI went to half-mast in tribute. One of the most spectacular military campaigns of all time began in March 1862, when a large Union army moved into the valley and forced Jackson to abandon Winchester. The Confederate general took his men southward up the Shenandoah to the vicinity of Mount Jackson. His responsibilities continued to be twofold: to block any federal advance into the heart of the Shenandoah, and, if possible, to prevent the enemy there from reinforcing General George B. McClellan's army, then moving on Richmond. 10 days after occupying Winchester, Federals gave indication of withdrawing from the valley. Jackson wasted no time in putting his outmanned force in motion. The enemy must be contained, if not defeated. Marching hard through sleet and rain, the Confederates retraced their steps until they came to the hamlet of Kernstown, just south of Winchester. Here was one of many instances in the Civil War when a village became a battleground and the front yard was turned into a killing field. Robert Glass was a Virginia militia officer on duty in March 1862 when the Battle of Kernstown began. He had no idea that his home, immediately behind me, would become the western edge for the battle at Kernstown. On Sunday afternoon around 2 o'clock, March 23rd, Jackson and his column halted here at Kernstown. He had led his men 31 miles in 40 hours. Only about 3,000 had withstood the trip. It was overcast and cold. The roads were muddy. The men were tired. And yet they stopped because Federal cannon atop Pritchett's Hill were contesting his advance on Winchester. Jackson faced a number of problems here. The first was it was Sunday, the Lord's Day, and Jackson deeply respected the Sabbath. But he concluded it was best to launch an attack now, and if he could gain victory, it would be a triumph for the Lord. In order to combat the obstacle of Pritchett's Hill, Jackson decided to send his men straight west and try and take command of a low, heavily wooded elevation known as Sand Ridge. If he could get that, he could then flank the Union column, get behind Pritchett's Hill, and march directly on Winchester. Far on the Union right flank was one of the key positions on the Kernstown field. It was a stone wall originally built to divide pasture land. Now whoever controlled the wall had a strong advantage on the battlefield. The 37th Virginia made a dash for the wall. So did the 110th Pennsylvania. The Virginians won the race and, according to Jackson, opened a destructive fire which drove back the Northern forces in great disorder. Union reinforcements soon forced the Virginians to fall back. By then, bloodstains coated both sides of what had been an innocent stone barrier. Today, 130 years later, this is all that is left of the stone wall. It stands silent inside the woods, gentle rain lapping over the stones. But here was a scene of great sacrifice and heroism on the part of American boys north and south. This stone wall, or what is left of it, serves as a reminder of a great war, and of such it should be preserved as much as possible for future generations to see. Jackson discovered too late that he was heavily outnumbered at Kernstown. When his left flank gave way for want of ammunition, he abandoned the field. 3 hours of fighting produced almost 1,300 casualties, with Confederates suffering the higher percentage, as the attacking force usually does. Yet Jackson's tactical failure became a strategic success. His little band of 3,000 men had struck with such force that Shields was convinced a full 15,000-man division had attacked him. He so informed Washington officials. Federal divisions were thereupon ordered to remain in the Shenandoah to guard against another thrust from the unpredictable Jackson. Where the valley had once been a buffer zone, it now became a major theater of operations. Jackson fell back up the valley to Conrad's store east of Harrisonburg and known today as Elkton. The position was at the southern end of the Massanutten Mountain. This imposing barrier stretched 50 miles from Harrisonburg to Strasburg and actually divided the valley into two separate parts. For most of April, while Jackson strengthened his forces and developed a master plan, Federal units threatened from 3 different directions. General Nathaniel P. Banks with the largest army advanced southward along the Valley Turnpike. Some 40,000 Union soldiers were at Fredericksburg and poised to head into the valley from the east. In the Allegheny Mountains, 2 ranges to the west, were General John C. Fremont and 15,000 more Federals. Jackson was not deterred by the situation. His hope was to keep Banks and Fremont west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the easternmost range of the Alleghenies, and isolated from one another. At the same time, the Southern commander wanted to hold General Irvin McDowell's full corps at Fredericksburg and stop it from moving either on Richmond or into the valley. To do all of this, Jackson was facing almost 10-to-1 odds in manpower. His task seemed hopeless. Yet old Jack felt that deception, hard marches, and unexpected attacks delivered in strength would accomplish his goals. As for the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy, he would petition God to handle that problem. Near the end of April, Jackson got what he needed most, reinforcements. General Richard Ewell's division of 8,000 Confederates headed toward Jackson's base at Conrad's Store. Another 2,000 Southerners under General Edward Johnson were guarding the mountain passes west of Stanton. That town was the only railroad link between the Valley and Richmond. Stanton was also a major supply depot and as vital to control of the southern end of the Shenandoah as Winchester was to the northern end. Word came to Jackson in the last week of April that at least a portion of Fremont's command was advancing toward Stanton through the mountains to the west. Leaving Ewell to watch Banks' activity in the valley, Jackson secretly moved his command to Stanton and then began a hard 35-mile march over the mountains to the village of McDowell. There he expected to confront the van of Fremont's force, namely 4,000 Union soldiers under General Robert Milroy, a slim, sullen, sour officer in his mid-40s and a man of military experience. McDowell was 35 miles west of Stanton, and there the Federal Army had stopped. A mile away from McDowell and 600 feet straight up atop Sitlington's Hill, where we now are, Stonewall Jackson gathered his forces. On this knoll inside the village of McDowell, General Milroy first caught sight of the Confederates massing atop distant Sitlington's Hill. Milroy was not a professional soldier, and he quickly fell victim to reports that the Confederates were dragging cannon up to the distant heights. Rather than wait to be assaulted, Milroy determined that he would attack on his own, launch an assault with the hope of buying time until he could either receive reinforcements or get out of what he considered the death trap in McDowell. His target, those distant heights and the precipitous ground that stood between him and the Confederates. No more improbable site for a battle existed than that which was fought at McDowell that spring day of 1862. Certainly here in the East, no soldiers ever scaled more steeper heights than did these Midwestern boys serving under Milroy. For 600 feet, they had to come straight up, right into the face of concentrated Confederate fire. One Confederate officer was led later to say, "Such gallantry deserved a better fate." McDowell was strictly an infantry fight. Neither cavalry nor artillery played a major role here. I am standing in the middle of the Confederate battle line, this sector manned by the 12th Georgia. No earthworks were available. The Georgians stood at the lip of the hill, shooting downhill at the attacking Federals. Yet the Confederates did not realize that from the edge of the brow of the hill, they were silhouetted against the sky, and hence easy targets for the Federals. For 2 hours, the fighting raged, much of it hand-to-hand. General Edward Johnson went down, seriously wounded in the foot. A Virginia colonel rallied his men when the line was about to break by shouting, "Remember, men, you are Virginians. Do not let them take your soul." Around 6 o'clock that evening, the lines fell apart in mutual exhaustion, and the Battle of McDowell ended. This is the Hall House in the middle of McDowell. Here on May 8, 1862, General Milroy had his headquarters. Here on May 9, 1862, General Jackson had his headquarters. It was from this home early that morning that Jackson sent a cryptic message to Richmond. "God blessed our arms with victory at McDowell yesterday." Confederate authorities immediately hastened to look at maps to discover where Jackson and McDowell were. The Battle of McDowell lasted from 4 p.m. until nightfall. Although Federals inflicted twice as many casualties as they suffered, they could not shatter Jackson's lines. Milroy left the field under cover of darkness. Jackson gave pursuit for several days. Meanwhile, Confederate engineers closed the mountain passes, thus protecting Jackson's western flank in the southern half of the Shenandoah. Now Jackson was ready to clear the enemy from all of the valley. Thanks in large part to his map maker, Major Jedediah Hotchkiss, Jackson could discuss valley terrain as easily as he could quote scripture. He knew that it was 80 miles on the macadamized Valley Turnpike from Stanton to Winchester. The major line of transportation in the Shenandoah at the time was the famed Valley Turnpike. Begun in 1834, the road stretched from Winchester to Stanton. It was a two-lane macadamized pike, paved 18 feet wide with pulverized limestone packed tightly to make the road impervious to rain. Road shoulders were 2 feet wide on each side. Not only was the pike double-laned, which was exceedingly rare for that time, it was also unusually level. No grade exceeded 3 degrees. Further, and in marked contrast to other roads then in use east of the Mississippi River, the turnpike ran straight for miles at a clip. The 7-mile section between New Market and Mauzé contained one curve. Opened for traffic in 1840, the turnpike was an engineering wonder for that age. East of that main thoroughfare, inside the valley from Harrisonburg to Strasburg, lay the dark ridge called Massanutten Mountain. To the east of it was a parallel and almost hidden road. It snaked through the narrow Luray Valley to Front Royal and beyond. More importantly, in that 50-mile length of the Massanutten was only one place where the mountain could be crossed, namely through the pass connecting Luray with New Market. The next stage of Jackson's strategy was to unite his forces, sneak through the pass at New Market, use the Massanutten as a screen, and head north toward the major concentration at Strasburg and Front Royal of Union forces under General Banks. Jackson swiftly consolidated the soldiers of Ewell and Johnson with his own men. This gave him an army of 17,000 soldiers. It also gave him an almost 2-to-1 superiority in numbers over the Federals in and around Winchester. In the 3rd week of May, Jackson started his men on a hard march northward down the Shenandoah. The Confederates disappeared at New Market. Not a Union soldier in the valley knew where Jackson was. Throughout a hot but quiet May 22nd, Confederate soldiers marched steadily and secretly down the Luray Valley. This road would take them straight to Winchester, Banks's base of supplies. No obstacle stood in their path save the Union garrison at Front Royal, and not a man there had any reason to suspect that Stonewall Jackson was anywhere in the neighborhood. So here at Asbury Chapel, 4.5 miles south of Front Royal, Jackson predictably did the unpredictable. He divided his army. The cavalry he sent off to the left, and its job was to sever the communication lines between Front Royal and Banks's main force at Strasburg. A major part of the army Jackson would leave here at Asbury Chapel to guard the Luray Valley Road, and the strike force he would send off to the east, up on the shoulder of the Blue Ridge, to attack Front Royal from the south. Jackson's men always took pride in their marching ability, but that advance on the morning of May 23rd taxed their endurance to the limit. They were on this Snake Road, as it was called. The road went straight up in the air for a distance of about 2 miles, and it sorely strained the limits of these soldiers. Leg cramps began to develop. There was no wind because the trees and the underbrush on either side of the road blocked off all circulation. Many men began to develop leg cramps. Some staggered out of ranks to empty their stomachs and then staggered back into the columns again. It was an ordeal, but ahead of them they knew was old Jack, and in front of him would surely be victory. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of May 23rd, Jackson delivered a completely unexpected attack at Front Royal. The Union 1st Merlin was guarding the town. Jackson placed the Confederate 1st Merlin at the head of his assault. Within an hour or so, surprise and disorder was so total among the Federals that barely 200 of the Union regiment's 1,000 men escaped. Banks was at Strasburg when he heard of the Front Royal debacle. He quickly began a desperate retreat northward. Jackson, meanwhile, was moving with equal haste to get astride the Valley Turnpike. Through the night of May 24 and 25, the determined Confederate general forgot fatigue as he urged his men forward toward the major target, the town of Winchester. One of the secrets of Stonewall Jackson's success was his secrecy. He did not like to use main thoroughfares in advancing. Rather, he preferred abandoned wagon trails such as you see here, and he had a vast knowledge of them thanks to his map maker, Jed Hotchkiss, who knew the valley backwards and forwards and instructed Jackson the same way. And it was on roads such as this that much of the Valley campaign was waged. Confederate soldiers marching 4 abreast, the average marching day 17 hours. They were expected to cover 20-plus miles. He was the best topographical engineer in the Confederate Army and the man most responsible for Jackson's keen and sure knowledge of the Shenandoah Valley. And yet, Jedediah Hotchkiss was a Connecticut native who moved to New York, then migrated to Virginia to become headmaster of a boys' academy near Stanton. His hobbies took the form of surveying and map making. Hotchkiss was 34 when he joined Jackson's staff at the outset of the Valley campaign. Almost 6 feet tall, with sleepy eyes and scraggly beard, the serious-minded Hotchkiss had no vices, save a tendency, in Jackson's estimation, of talking too much. Hotchkiss and Jackson developed a close relationship based on a mutual devotion to duty and an abiding faith in God. The sun had not even cleared the top of the Blue Ridge Mountains on May 25th when Jackson unleashed a 2-prong attack on the Federal supply base that Winchester had become. By noon, the rout was complete. What was left of Banks's army was fleeing for the safety of the Potomac River 30 miles away. In the short campaign for Winchester, the Confederates had 400 casualties. But thanks to the inspiration of their commander, they had captured half of Banks's force, 9,000 small arms, and such a wealth of badly needed supplies that Confederates scornfully referred thereafter to their Union opponent as Commissary Banks. This is Stonewall Cemetery in Winchester, Virginia. Here lie 3,000 Confederate dead, many of whom gave their lives in defense of this town. In 1861, Winchester was a thriving commercial center of some 4,400 residents. Every road in the lower Shenandoah Valley converged here at Winchester. The Winchester and Potomac Railroad began here and snaked 32 miles northward to converge with the Baltimore and Ohio system at Harper's Ferry. In short, this town was absolutely vital to the security of the Shenandoah Valley at its northern end. For that reason, the town would change hands an incredible 70 times during the American Civil War. No town in this country suffered more from being in no man's land than Winchester. Jackson never forgot the tumultuous welcome that greeted him as he led his victorious little army into downtown Winchester. To his wife, he later wrote, "The people seemed nearly frantic with joy. Indeed, it would be almost impossible to describe their manifestations of rejoicing and gratitude. Our entrance into Winchester was one of the most stirring scenes of my life." The generals who fought against Jackson in the Valley campaign were indicative of the Northern tendency early in the war to appoint generals of prominent background, whether or not they were men with military experience. In the first and last battles of the Shenandoah campaign, Jackson faced 51-year-old General James Shields. He had come to the Civil War from Ireland by way of Illinois and the West Coast. Shields had once challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel. He led troops with distinction in the Mexican War, where a battle wound helped get him elected a U.S. Senator from 2 different states. Beneath the politician, Shields was a competent and well-balanced Army officer. In the Valley, he led solid soldiers from the Midwestern states. However, this lean, tough, combative Shields acquired the mistaken and dangerous belief that Stonewall Jackson was afraid of him. The Union officer assigned to secure the Valley was 46-year-old Nathaniel P. Banks. The 4th-ranking general in the Union armies, Banks's entire professional career was as a New England political leader. Over the years, he had changed party affiliation 7 times, which, a supporter explained, gave Banks philosophical flexibility. This former Speaker of the House of Representatives and Governor of Massachusetts owed his military commission solely to political influence. Banks was a decent man and thorough gentleman. He cut a fine figure, had handsome features, and wore a spectacular uniform. He possessed an audacity born of ignorance. Banks gave the military everything he had. The problem was that as a general, he did not have much to give. By the time of the Valley Campaign, John C. Fremont was a shop-worn hero and misguided abolitionist. His defenders praised him as handsome and precocious. His detractors thought him headstrong and unstable. Earlier, Fremont had surveyed much of the American frontier, which earned him the title Pathfinder of the West. Yet his repeated disobedience to orders led to a forced resignation from the Army. Fremont was one of California's first U.S. senators. In 1856, he had been the Republican Party's first presidential nominee. Lincoln appointed Fremont a general for political reasons, and the president sent him to command the remote Allegheny Mountains Department simply to get him out of the way. Fremont would move with hesitation throughout this campaign. Jackson would never defeat him soundly. The Confederate commander would simply push, and that would knock Fremont out of the ballgame. Smashing victories by the strange, silent, pious Confederate general had now disrupted the entire Union offensive in Virginia. With Banks defeated and useless on the northern bank of the Potomac, and with Jackson's army poised like a dagger at the northern end of the valley, federal authorities in Washington reacted desperately. James Shields' 20,000-man division, which had just arrived at Fredericksburg, was ordered to march back to the valley. John Fremont's mountain army got orders to move with all dispatch into the Shenandoah. With Shields marching west and Fremont advancing east, both toward Strasburg behind Jackson's position, the Confederate commander seemingly was about to be caught in the jaws of a massive Union vice. The Union strategy failed because of a combination of vacillation on the parts of Shields and Fremont and incredible marching on the part of Jackson's so-called foot cavalry. In less than a day, Confederate units marched between 35 and 50 miles through inclement weather, and all of them slipped through to safety before Fremont and Shields could barricade the door to the valley. Jackson retired to Harrisonburg, then turned southeast to a point where the north and south rivers came together to form the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. Fremont was giving chase up the Valley Turnpike. Shields was marching south up the Luray Valley Road. Jackson skillfully saw to it that all bridges and mountain passes between Fremont and Shields were immobilized, thereby blocking any junction between the two Union columns. With a calmness born of confidence, the Southern general positioned Ewell's part of the army at Cross Keys to face Fremont, while Jackson himself formed his men in battle line 3 miles away at Port Republic. On June 8, Fremont gingerly moved forward to make contact with Ewell's Confederates in the undulating farm country known as Cross Keys. Shenandoah Valley historian John Heatwall explains what happened.
While Jackson and Ewell moved down the Port Republic Road to Cross Keys in the village of Port Republic with the main body of Confederates, General Turner Ashby fought a rearguard action here on Chestnut Ridge. Under his command were the 58th Virginia Infantry and the 1st Maryland Infantry. They were fighting 4 companies of the famous Pennsylvania Bucktails of the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves under the command of Colonel Thomas Kane. The fighting here was fairly severe because the Bucktails were known for their sharpshooting prowess. One of the Bucktails remembered that we shot them down like pigeons.
Turner Ashby was truly inspiring that Friday. When the 58th Virginia recoiled under a heavy Union fire, Ashby, on foot because his horse had been killed, rallied the men. He seemed to be enjoying the action tremendously. "Look at Ashby," one Confederate shouted. "See how happy he is." Ashby got his men together and staged a counterattack. He had just shouted, "Forward, men, for God's sakes, forward," when a bullet ripped through his body, and here at this spot, Turner Ashby died. He was the first general of heroic proportions to fall in Virginia during the Civil War. Jackson's cavalry chief in the Valley Campaign had been a Northern Virginia farmer before the war. Turner Ashby was then 31, of medium height with hair, eyes, and complexion so dark that people thought him of Middle East background. A gifted horseman with a passion for danger, Ashby seemed to be the reincarnation of a knight in olden days. Offsetting those assets was Ashby's unwillingness or inability to control his horsemen effectively. His non-performance would cripple Jackson's movements on several occasions, just as his presence inspired the Southern cause at other times. The militarily untutored Ashby seemed to dwell in the naive belief that simple patriotism was an adequate substitute for discipline.
General Fremont made the mistake of all inexperienced battle commanders in not reconnoitering the ground. He sent General Julius Stahl's brigade against the strong Confederate right, while almost neglecting the Confederate left where he had his best chance of success. Along these ridges and through these fields, Fremont came into a rude awakening of what war was about.
In the tree line immediately behind me occurred one of the most vicious volleys of the entire Civil War. The 8th New York in Fremont's force was a totally German regiment. It had seen no action until it reached here at Cross Keys. It became the spearhead. Indeed, it was the only major regiment to launch an assault. It came this way, went down this hill, and it reached that gully that you see behind me. The Confederates were on the immediate hill beyond, a mere 40 yards away, when the 8th New York came up out of that gully. And at a distance of 40 yards, 3 regiments, approximately 1,000 muskets, delivered a point-blank fire literally into the faces of these New Yorkers. Over half of the regiment, 260 men, were killed or wounded by this single blast. Fremont's effort to hit the Confederate right flank collapsed. Immediately after the fighting ended, New York correspondent Charles Webb, who was with Fremont's army, walked through the wheat field where the 8th New York lay in death. He noted, "The poor fellows lie around in all postures and positions, some on the very spot where they fell, others propped up against the fences where they had crawled to die. Many of them lie on their backs with their arms stretched wearily, callously out, resembling men who have thrown themselves on the ground to rest and suddenly sank into slumber." With Fremont thrown into confusion on June 8th at Cross Keys, Jackson turned his attention the next day to his old adversary, James Shields. That Union general had advanced his division to the northern outskirts of the village of Port Republic. Early on Monday morning, June 9th, and without waiting for his army to consolidate, Jackson ordered an assault against the hastily prepared Union defenses.
I'm standing in the middle of the main Union battle line. Here on the morning of June 9th, 1862, Confederates approached this line from the fields behind me. They came under fire from the infantry regiments here and also from the coaling to my right. Later in the day, Ewell's forces came up from Cross Keys and also crossed these fields, coming against this battle line.
Jackson could neither win nor lose the Battle of Port Republic out on the open ground. Although he outnumbered his opponent by 2.5 to 1, the Federals had a decided advantage. It was a coaling station on top of a spur of the Blue Ridge Mountains about 70 feet above the bottomland. There, the Federals had placed heavy artillery and a sizable number of troops. Until Jackson seized that high ground, the Battle of Port Republic remained in doubt, and so did the Valley Campaign. General Dick Taylor's Louisiana Brigade consisted of 1,700 men. They outnumbered the Federals up here at the coaling station by a wide margin. And yet the Louisianians were making an uphill frontal attack, and they were doing so right into the face of Union artillery firing at point-blank range. In addition, the Louisianians were alone. They had no support troops on either side or in their rear. Fighting was vicious, hand-to-hand in places, but eventually, late in the morning, the Louisianians seized control of the station and brought Stonewall Jackson victory at Port Republic. Cross Keys and Port Republic ended an almost unbelievable 1862 campaign. Jackson had saved the Shenandoah Valley from Federal occupation and destruction. With never more than 17,000 men, he had totally thwarted the plans of over 50,000 Federal soldiers organized into 3 armies and each having the single objective of defeating him. In 48 days, Jackson's foot cavalry had marched over 600 miles. Those farm boys, students, and clerks had fought 4 battles, 6 skirmishes, and a dozen delaying actions. Confederates had inflicted 5,000 casualties at a loss of less than half that number. Jackson would not accept accolades that he had accomplished such smashing successes. Behind me is an old oak tree. But for the past 134 years to the folks here in the Mount Meridian area, this has been called the Prayer Tree. For here on June 15, 1862, Jackson came to the camps of his beloved Stonewall Brigade, and here he performed the ultimate duty to give thanks to God for the victory in this recent campaign. God has been our shield, and to his name be all the glory. That was Jackson's summation of the Valley campaign. Such faith is commendable. As God's instrument, Jackson had made astounding achievements. His strategic masterpiece changed the whole face of the war in Virginia. The seemingly unstoppable Union advance on Richmond ground to a halt as defeated and dejected Union columns filed out of the Shenandoah. In that second spring of the Civil War, following months of loss after loss, the Confederate cause shuddered with pessimism. The specter of defeat loomed large. Suddenly, from the obscure western part of Virginia came good news and a flash of hope. The quiet but determined Jackson had combined initiative, secrecy, audacity, rapid marches, heavy attacks in unexpected places, and dogged pursuit in the quest for total victory. Love for and faith in Jackson by his soldiers amounted to idolatry. A Richmond newspaper late that spring termed Jackson and his Valley warriors chief in the hearts of the nation. And the newspaper added, "Strange it may appear, news from the armies within 5 miles of Richmond is of secondary importance. Invariably, the crowds which daily flock around the bulletin boards ask first, what news from Jackson?" From the Valley campaign, Jackson moved on to other battlefields. The 7 Days, Cedar Mountain, 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg. Then in May 1863 at Chancellorsville, it all ended. By then, this orphan from the mountains of Western Virginia had become arguably the most famous soldier on earth. His death was the greatest loss that the Southern Confederacy faced, and the loss to Robert E. Lee's army was irreparable, for Jackson had given that army mobility which Lee had to have for survival. And yet Jackson died peacefully. He had kept the faith and fought the good fight. What else can one ask of any human being? Hence, as long as faith has meaning and human goodness has value, the image and the inspiration of Stonewall Jackson will never die.